Good afternoon. My name is Doug Swanson. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the National Archives, and I want to welcome you all to another of our Lincoln Bicentennial Noontime Book Lectures. Today's speaker is Gary Ecelbarger. He is the author and co-author of 7 books and more than a dozen magazine articles about events and personalities of the 19th century. He is a popular symposium speaker, a history tour guide, and served as historical consultant for battlefield preservation in the Shenandoah Valley, which is where I live, so he kind of affects me a little bit. Mr. Ecelbarger is also a Lincoln Scholar with a featured article in the current issue of the Journal of Abraham Lincoln Association. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ecelbarger to the National Archives, where he will discuss his most recent book, which we have a copy of here. The Great Comeback, How Abraham Lincoln Beat the Odds to Win the 1860 Republican Nomination, which has been acclaimed by critics and fellow Lincoln authors. So ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you to Gary.
Good afternoon, folks. As you can see, I'm blessed with Lincoln's height. Not. But we have a good, close-knit group. We didn't need the 150 or whatever. I think we'll all be singing Kumbaya before this event's over. We're going to be that close-knit. We just celebrated, of course, the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth back in February, but I'm here to talk about another anniversary that a lot of people don't quite recognize with Lincoln, and that is we are in the midst of the sesquicentennial, or the 150th anniversary of his presidential bid, and that will culminate not, we could say, with the election of 1860, but the zenith of that whole campaign will be the nomination convention of May 18th, 1860. And why I say that is the zenith is it was pretty well known that whoever won that Republican nomination in Chicago in May was going to win the presidential election, because the Democratic Party was in the midst of splitting into 2 separate candidates who were destined to steal some votes from each other, and there will be the entry of what we would call a third-party candidate today, John Bell of Tennessee. So even 4 months before the November election, 4 months before the election, Abraham Lincoln was so sure he was going to win, and normally you'd think he'd be normally cautious. Lincoln was so sure that he will write on the 4th of July to a friend, "No one knows what a day may bring forth, but it looks today as if the Chicago ticket will be elected." And of course, he doesn't talk about himself in the first person or even a third person. He says the Chicago ticket. So what I want to talk about today is how he got to be at the top of that Chicago ticket. It's quite a story. I approach this book like I do every other book I write. I ask myself questions. Yes, I talk to myself, but in this case, it was a real important question. The question is, how does a two-time Senate loser, come back to win his party's nomination within a year and a half of that second Senate defeat? It's only happened once in our history. And the fact that it happened to Abraham Lincoln makes that story much more intriguing. So, of course, trying to research this, I had to go through to make sure that this hadn't been covered at least in a book-length treatment, looked at the recent literature. And anybody have any idea how many books have been written about Abraham Lincoln? 16,000. Now 16,001. But I mean, there's a lot of books written about him, and I'm sure thousands of them have at least talked about the convention or the process leading up to it, but certainly it's been given a very cursory treatment. So that gave me the benefit of at least focusing on that year and a half. Remember, how does a 2-time Senate loser come back and win that nomination? What you have to realize, since you've just all endured or experienced, whatever word you want to use for it, the conventions and the whole nomination process of the last couple of years, keep in mind 2 very important points between the process of 2007 and 2008 versus yesteryear, meaning 1860 in this case. There were no primaries and there were no caucuses back then. So the people that are going to choose the presidential nominee are going to be delegates at the National Convention. So what you saw, whether you watched the Democratic one or the Republican one or both, the roll call of the states, and it's done in alphabetical order, and it's really kind of like an anticlimactic formality because the primaries and caucuses have already determined that. That was the be-all, end-all event of the conventions all the way up to the early part of the 20th century. So keep that in mind. The choice of the Republican Party in their second presidential contest, the 1861, is going to be chosen by 465 delegates from the various states just about all of them from the North, because Republicans in the South were mutually exclusive. Whoever the Republican candidate will be in 1860, they won't be winning any Southern state because of their slavery position. And those 465 delegates, you needed to clear one over the halfway point. So the magic number is going to be 233. And there's going to be 12 Republican candidates presented there, 12. What's also different from the conventions now versus back in 1860 is that the candidates themselves didn't go because it was considered beneath the office to be that ambitiously seeking it. You had a team of supporters or a delegation there to try to win that process for you. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but that's really the main difference. No primaries, no caucuses. You didn't officially throw your hat in the ring. You didn't go out and say, I am running for president because, as I said, you didn't want to look too ambitious for the office. So you went out, you made public speeches, you wrote letters that you hoped got published in the prominent media source at the time, which was newspapers. But you did that as an exponent of the party, a spokesman, a statesman of the party, and you would hope that you would start to garner some recognition for your principles and hopefully start build up some support for it. So how does Abraham Lincoln end up as even one of the 12 candidates to be considered? Two-time Senate loser. He lost in 1854 as a Whig. He lost in 1858 in his race against Stephen A. Douglas. Back then, they chose senators not by a popular vote like they've done since the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913, I believe. But before then, it was done as indirectly. You chose your state legislators, House and Senate representatives, who would meet in a General Assembly and then have the official vote, usually in the winter after the November election. So on January 5th, 1859, Abraham Lincoln officially lost that second Senate race to Douglas in the 21st General Assembly of Illinois by a vote of 54 to 46. What a lot of people don't realize is his bid for the presidency began the very next day, informally. He gets together with a group of prominent Republicans who were there for the General Assembly to either witness it or be a part of it, a lot of his lawyer friends in Illinois. And the Republican Party in Illinois had just gone through the ringer because he had just lost. They are in debt. And they're meeting in the basement of the state capitol, which now is the old state capitol, which you can visit as a tourist. And in the basement was the state library. So they use the state library on a snowy Thursday. And they get down there and they're talking about the state of the party, and they're really in a lot of trouble because there have been a lot of major defections in the Republican ranks nationally, including Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, who seemed to be supporting Douglas in 1858 over Lincoln, which is an irony because the Republican Party formed in opposition of Stephen A. Douglas, and now he was starting to get some support from some Republicans. And they were talking about people who they could possibly support in 1860. And as Lincoln's friends are bringing up, maybe there's a dozen people in this room, and as they're bringing up names of prominent Westerners, as they would call it, we would say Midwesterners, that they could consider for the presidency, Lincoln's silently stewing because in his mind they're not bringing up the most important name and the most obvious name, his. And I think they're doing that out of deference to him. I mean, 24 hours earlier, he just lost a Senate race. But in the midst of this, Lincoln stands up and says, why don't you run me? I can be nominated, I can be elected, and I can run the government. As one person in that room stated, we all looked at him and thought he was kidding, and then saw that he was completely serious. They made no specific overtures on that specific day, but in their minds, this was Lincoln's start of his bid for the presidency in 1860. Now, this is January of 1859. And he's not really being talked up that much except for almost as a local or Illinois support that this is the guy that really should have won the Senate race. But he's still looked at as a guy that lost to the potential Democratic nominee, Stephen A. Douglas. Well, there will be a specific strategy devised 3 months later, in April of 1859. And I'm going to call it the under-the-radar strategy. Now, I know there's no radar in 1859, but just work with me on this one. The whole idea is to be a kind of an undetected candidate. And this strategy was devised between Lincoln and members of the Illinois State Republican Central Committee. And what they decided to do in this meeting in Bloomington in 1859 was that he would be quietly supported by the state Republican Central Committee members who would honeycomb through the state and garner support for Lincoln, because one of the big hurdles you have to cross to be presented as a candidate at the national convention is to get your full and probably unanimous support at a state convention. So Illinois is a big state. The state convention is going to have several hundred delegates there, and it's important for them to garner support from Lincoln from as north in the Chicago tier, 400 miles south to the southern tip, which is Cairo, Illinois. So they wanted to make sure that he was going to get full Republican support there. They were going to quell any attempts by newspaper editors, like Illinois newspaper editors, who would try to boom Lincoln's name out too early because they didn't want him to be seen as a candidate, or else he's going to attract criticism from the other top-tier candidates in the country, people like William Henry Seward, the prominent senator of New York, Simon Cameron, the corrupt but prominent senator in Pennsylvania, Governor Salmon P. Chase, Edward Bates in Missouri. There's a lot of prominent candidates to be considered for the Republican nomination, and Lincoln's supporters in this meeting didn't want him to be brought out so early as one of them. The other thing that they already had to knock down was any talk about Lincoln being a vice presidential match on any ticket. This would be a death knell. And it was real attractive to put a Westerner, Midwesterner like Lincoln, along a prominent candidate. So they were talking up Cameron Lincoln tickets or Seward Lincoln nomination tickets. So they wanted to make sure that Lincoln had no interest at all at being a vice presidential linkage on anybody's ticket. So they stopped that. And then it would be up to Lincoln to do the rest. Before I do that, I got to tell you how well this under-the-radar strategy worked. The head of the Republicans' Central Committee in Illinois is a man named Norman Judd, who was Lincoln's campaign manager in that losing race in 1858. Well, as head of the Illinois committee, he was invited out to New York City toward the end of 1859 with 20 other Republican committee heads from the other states who are going to meet at the Astor House in New York City to decide two things: when and where the Republican National Convention is going to be held. Now, they got at the the when pretty quickly. They decided on June of 1860, and then that eventually will be moved up to the middle of May. Where is going to be the problem? Because there are so many prominent Republicans being talked up that everybody was shooting down any state where these people hailed from as a bias or at least an advantage to them. So you couldn't bring up any place in New York City because that was an advantage to William Henry Seward. You couldn't bring up Pittsburgh because that was Simon Cameron's advantage. You couldn't bring up Columbus or Cincinnati because that would be an advantage for Salmon P. Chase. The state or the city that looked like it was going to win hands down because it had hotels, it had railroads, it was supposed to be St. Louis. All right? But St. Louis really had a candidate to consider as well, and that was Edward Bates, who was an old Whig. He really wasn't even declared as a Republican, but they knew he was going to be presented as a potential nominee. So that was one strike against him, and they're arguing about this. The other problem with St. Louis is it was in a state where Republicans had no chance to win in a general election. Okay, as I said, no southern state is going to vote for any Republican, so they didn't want that convention. There was some angst about having a convention in a state that had no chance of going Republican in 1860. So while all the parties are fighting about this, the different heads, Judd stood up and said, "Why don't you hold it in Chicago? It's a neutral place where all of you front-running candidates have an equal chance." Little did they realize that he's up there in support of Abraham Lincoln, who's under the radar. And when the final votes come through, Chicago will win over St. Louis by one vote, Judd's. All right, so they got everything set up, and I'll talk about the importance of getting the home state advantage for this. Now, the rest is up to Lincoln. And this is important because Lincoln has given a lot of speeches since he came back from a political hibernation back in 1854. Maybe 160 of them between 1854 and 1859. But he only gave one speech outside the state of Illinois in that period of time. And that includes the Lincoln-Douglas debates and his House Divided speech and the big Springfield and Peoria addresses. All these speeches were Illinois speeches. But if Lincoln wants to be a national candidate, he's going to have to spread out. Now, there is a traditional idea or belief that Abraham Lincoln is going to win the nomination, and you may have heard a version of this story because of a couple of reasons. One is that he's nationally prominent because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and even though he lost, he did so well in those debates that he's going to be considered for as presidential timber. The second reason is they say that he gives a speech in New York City, the Cooper Union Address. Before then, nobody really considered him presidential timber, but after he makes this prominent speech to a New York audience and gets coverage through the East, Lincoln is considered a top prospect for the nomination just several weeks before the convention. And those two factors help. I don't mean to diminish the importance of the debates or the Cooper Union speech, but you have to put it entirely in perspective. The problem with the Lincoln-Douglas debates is had he kept up the momentum after those debates had ended in October of 1858, you could make a real strong case for those. However, Lincoln went into a mini hibernation again and didn't give another political speech after those debates for an entire year. 1 year, out of sight, out of mind. And it's almost like he's doing this purposely. 4th of July, what a great time to give a political speech. He's talking about food in a place north of Springfield, almost purposely avoiding it. Maybe it's I talked about an under-the-radar strategy. Maybe there's a rope-a-dope strategy involved with it as well. But he's clearly not coming out prominently and giving a lot of political speeches. And realize this isn't a popularity contest. It's not a caucus or primary type of voting that will get you the nomination. There are none. It's going to be delegates at the convention. So how popular you were back in 1858 isn't going to mean very much in 1860 unless you come out and establish your position. So in dramatic fashion, Lincoln will do this beginning in September of 1859. 1 year after those Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln makes a tour through Ohio. He gives 5 speeches in Ohio, follows it up with 2 in Indiana, 4 in Wisconsin, 7 in Kansas Territory. And so by the time he goes out to New York City, Cooper Union is part of this tour. And if you step back and look at it, it's pretty obvious what's going on here. Remember what I said? Between the 1854 and the summer of 1859, 160 speeches in those 5 years. Only one of them had been given outside the state of Illinois. Now, from September of 1859 to March of 1860, in that 6-month period, 30 speeches in 8 states. Is that a coincidence? That's somebody running for president, and he's doing it under the radar, and it's working beautifully. He gets coast-to-coast coverage of his speeches, north and south, east and west, more than any Lincoln-Douglas debate, and he's doing it without having to share the stage with the little giant who had counterpunched him so beautifully to win that Senate race in 1858. So the Cooper Union speech is part of that 30-speech tour. The reason why Lincoln even got invited to give the speech in Cooper Union is because the folks in New York City were reading his Cincinnati speech, which got covered in Washington and New York and all the way out in Portland, Oregon. Back then, you didn't have transcontinental telegraph or even the Pony Express, so it got published in Portland 3 months after he delivered it. But they published it entirely, word for word as he delivered it. They just took the Cincinnati Gazette version, and that speech carried all over the place. So Lincoln is getting his message out. He's establishing himself in a middle range position, as we call it. We would call it moderate today, and I'll talk about those positions. And it works beautifully. The members of the Illinois State Republican Central Committee do their job. They go through the entire state of Illinois, and when the delegates meet at the state convention in Decatur, Illinois, in May 9th, 1860, he will get the unanimous vote of those delegates, and they will send a delegation, 22, to the National Convention, and because it's in Chicago, they don't have far to go, 10 days later, and they are going to be rock solid for Abraham Lincoln. Now, I didn't really answer the question yet, right? I said, how does a 2-time Senate loser win that nomination? I've only answered the point about saying how he's at least going to be considered in the mix. Here's the problem. Okay, he's going to be one of 12 to consider, but he's the only one of the 12, essentially, that doesn't have a prominent political position at the time of that national convention, which begins on May 16th. if you think about it, you have a lot of senators that are going to be highly considered, like Seward and Cameron. You have governors like Salmon P. Chase. You even have a Supreme Court justice who's being considered for the nomination. Now, Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Get this one. This Supreme Court justice is going to be the candidate for the nomination. He's in his 70s, and his name is John McClain. Go figure. All right? So they're considering him as well. So Lincoln is the only one of those 12, or one of a few of the 12, that doesn't have a political position. He's a lawyer in Illinois. He's not a sitting anything, right? He's a lawyer in Illinois that had lost a couple Senate races. But he does have the Illinois delegation with him. And so really the key here is, how does this thing work? How does that ladder get flipped around? If he's the bottom rung of a 12-rung ladder, how does that thing flip around in Chicago where he becomes on the top rung? And it's a dramatic thing to consider, because on the eve of that convention, a week before, there are campaign handbooks published, and 2 of them don't even mention Lincoln as even one of the candidates to consider in Chicago. And Harper's Weekly Illustrated newspaper, most of the time you never knew what these people looked like because you just saw prints about them in regular newspapers. There are a couple illustrated newspapers. And finally, Lincoln's image will show up in the Harper's Weekly issue in May 12th issue, along with 11 other candidates, and he's got to be the most inconspicuously displayed feature of that entire centerfold piece. He's kind of at the bottom. He's not the top tier of people to look at. So he's really not highly considered at all. But what happens at that Chicago convention, even before the gavel pounds to start that thing on Wednesday, May 16th, is dramatic. Lincoln's team will get up there on Saturday, the Saturday before the Wednesday beginning of the convention. And by Monday morning, newspapers as far as Philadelphia and Cincinnati are starting to announce with inside information what is absolutely accurate. They say this 2 days before the convention begins. This is a 2-man race between William Seward and Abraham Lincoln. 2 days before the convention begins. So the idea that Abraham Lincoln is a dark horse at the convention, not true at all. Before that convention begins, he is already one of the 2 highest considered candidates. What in the world happened in the 2 days for that to occur? All right? That's what we need to end. I'm going to bring this out because I know you have goosebumps and you have a tingle up the spine and you want to know. You know he wins the thing. How? How does he win? All right. We're going to answer that for you. There are really 3 ingredients to this whole product yielding Abraham Lincoln the nominee. And I can mention them in any order because they're all going to be important. So let's start with the messenger and the message, and then the team that supports him. The messenger, of course, is Abraham Lincoln himself. Now, you might think that this isn't going to be as important at the national convention because I already said he's not going to be there, right? He's not there because normally the candidates for the nomination don't show up at the convention. For those that want the trivia, who was the first president that was actually at his own nomination convention? It's actually before that. That's the answer most. He was there by plan. There was one person. There you go. The answer is James Garfield, who was there to support Grant and ended up being the dark horse candidate. So Roosevelt by plan, Garfield by accident. And there's even a picture of Garfield at the 1880 convention. So you're not supposed to be there until the 1900s. So how is the messenger important? Remember, most of the people at the convention, the 465 delegates, right? So what do you need to win? What's that number? 233. I'll keep asking. I'm going to keep asking that. So there's 465 delegates there. I guarantee you that fewer than 100 of those delegates had never met Abraham Lincoln before, had never seen him giving a speech, and until they went to Chicago and the picture was on display, probably never even knew what Abraham Lincoln looked like, which, if you've seen some pictures of Lincoln, might not be such a bad thing. All right, but the important point is they knew the name. The name has circulated through Republican circles and in the press even before the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln was second in the balloting for vice president in 1856. In the first convention, it had John C. Fremont as the Republicans' first candidate. And what they learned in that first convention and the following election, the Republicans, was 2 things. One is that the South and Republicans were mutually exclusive, as I said before, and that Fremont actually did pretty well. And he would have beaten James Buchanan. You know, I'm related to James Buchanan. Figures one of the worst ones, and I ended up with a distant cousin. Is that if there are four, what we would call, they call them doubtful states in the Republican circles in 1860, we would call them battleground states. There were four states that Buchanan won that had, if Fremont had won those, he would have been the president, even without winning a southern state. And that includes Pennsylvania, which is Buchanan's home state, New Jersey, Indiana, and Illinois. Ding, ding, ding. All right, so keep that in mind. So that's what they learned in 1856. All right, so the point to be made here is that they're going to think about the way we think about electing people now, or at least people in political circles. You think of battleground states. Who's going to win battleground states? So that's one important point to consider as well. So Lincoln the messenger is not going to be as important as the national figure, except that you had to have a solid support from his home base in Illinois. And because Lincoln spent 30 years in Illinois, even his enemies liked the man. Okay, but the problem with the Republican Party, and Illinois is a perfect example of this, the geography really set the tone of the type of views that you would establish. You think about the distance between the northern tier, you know, where Rockford and the Chicago area and Galena, et cetera. That area between there and Cairo, the southern tip, 400 miles. In other words, you draw a line across, the northern part of Illinois is as north as the Massachusetts-Maine border. And the southern part of Illinois is as south as the North Carolina-Virginia border. Get what I'm saying? All right, so you know the politics is going to be more southern as you go further into what is then called Egypt, that part of the state. Get it? Cairo, Egypt, all right? And then the northern part is going to be more abolitionist. All right, that's the southern, or the northern tier where Chicago is. The problem is when the Republican Party is a big tent fusion party. It is not the GOP, the grand old party. It is the BNP, the brand new party. And the problem with a brand new party is that its elements, its makeup, were people that were politically opposed to each other just a few years before. The Republican Party consisted of old Democrats and old Whigs, and old Free Soilers, and old American and Know-Nothing elements. These were people that were politically opposed to each other, and they still hated each other. The only thing they agreed on was the main principle of the Republican Party that they all agreed upon, and that was not to extend slavery into the territorial region of the United States, what will eventually become the Dakotas, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, of course, and part of Colorado and Utah. All of that, it had the threat of having slavery extending into it when Stephen A. Douglas passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. So much like the Whig Party formed in opposition to Andrew Jackson, the Republican Party formed in the mid-1850s in opposition to Stephen A. Douglas. But the only thing they all had in common was that they hated the idea of slavery extending into the territories. After that, there are so many differences that the party was really hard to hold together. All right, and I don't like to think about this as wings, but now I'm going to talk about Lincoln and the message. So let's look at it this way. If you have the Democratic Party over here in 1860 and the Republican Party here, the most extreme end of the Republican Party was the abolition wing. Now you might say, hey, that's a good position to have. You're not only against slavery extending into territories, but you want an end to the fugitive slave law, and you want slavery to be expelled from even the southern states. All right. The problem with that is that A word, abolitionist in 1860, was like being called a communist in the 1950s. You weren't going to win any elections if you were tagged with that label. And Lincoln was not an abolitionist, and the reason why he wasn't is because of the constitutionality. Believe it or not, in 1859 and 1860, Lincoln was for the fugitive slave law, returning slaves to their owners. Harriet Beecher Stowe would not be a fan of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, abolitionists really hated him when he espoused that position, because one of them, William Lloyd Garrison, called Lincoln the slave hound of Illinois. Boy, you like that imagery, right? And it's not that he liked slavery. He's already on the record saying how much he hated it, but he thought the Constitution clearly protected it, and he was not for overriding the Constitution. And the reason for that reverence for the Constitution, in my mind, is if you think about this, And I've been up at 3 a.m. thinking about this, so I'm going to save you guys that thought, and you can sleep really well tonight and not worry about it. The longest time in our history that the Constitution has gone without an amendment, all right? We've all lived through several amendments, most of us, to the Constitution, but the longest time between amendments was between the 12th Amendment, which was ratified in 1802, and I hope you're all writing this down, and the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, ratified in 1865. Guess whose entire life was in between those two amendments? Abraham Lincoln. He lived his entire life knowing the Constitution as the original document with the Bill of Rights and just 2 amendments added to it, and to him that was a rock-solid document. And he was not for any belief system as much as he hated slavery that was for overturning the Constitution. All right, so he's against the abolitionists. And I'm simplifying this because there's a know-nothing aspect that had a nativist wing that shoots out in this direction, but I'll take that out in a minute. The other part, the other wing of the Republican Party, and this to me is a more fascinating one because normally the 2 wings of political parties butt up against each other, but in 1860, the Democratic wing the Republican wing overlapped the Democratic wing, and this was the group, as I mentioned with Horace Greeley, that I'll call them the popular sovereigntists. They actually supported the notion of popular sovereignty. Now, they did that for pragmatic reasons. They're saying, yes, as Douglas stated, you can vote slavery up or slavery down, which means that it might be voted down by the people that live in the territories, and that fits their Republican principles that would prevent slavery from extending in the territories. So technically, these folks are rolling the dice, hoping that territorial legislations would keep slavery out of their territories. Lincoln was dead set against this wing, and he constantly feared that Douglas would be a growing and burgeoning support of Republicans because he considered this completely immoral. So Lincoln's position, and this is where I'm getting to the message, had to come somewhere in between the popular sovereigntists and the abolitionists, and that's what Lincoln did in those 30 speeches in 8 different states, including Kansas, which won't be a state until 1860, but I'll predate statehood and count that as one of the states, is when he gave all those speeches, he put himself right in the middle, okay? An idea was he wasn't trying to unite red state and blue state, which sometimes I hear ascribed to him. He was trying to unite that big tent fusion party on his message, all right? Trying to show that a Republican can only be elected president if he followed those principles. Now, Lincoln's given these speeches not as an overt candidate, right? Because you didn't declare for the office, but he did it as a spokesman and a statesman of the party, wink, wink. I'm also the best person that harbors these views. And he did this in ways that were borderline brilliant, in my opinion. I'll give you one example. He gives a speech in Columbus, Ohio on September 16th, and the very next day he goes to Cincinnati. Now, the Cincinnati Gazette has just sent a reporter to Columbus, and they, on the morning that Lincoln arrives in Cincinnati to give a speech that night, they print his Columbus address. Well, this is a rarity. The very next issue of the Gazette, they'll print his Cincinnati speech. Consecutive issues, an out-of-state candidate with getting complete attention for 2 speeches. And the reason they did it is he gave a completely different speech in Cincinnati. And the reason why he did that was because Stephen A. Douglas had just gone through Cincinnati 8 days earlier. And if you are in the audience in Cincinnati and you're listening to Stephen Douglas, it makes sense what Douglas is about to say. He said, you in Ohio, as he's speaking in Cincinnati, are a free state, meaning slave-free, not because you were part of the Northwest Territory, which was a slave-free territory, but because of popular sovereignty. Because at the time the Ohio Territory had enough of a population to apply for statehood, the founding fathers of Ohio decided that the climate and soil and geography of Ohio was too far north to be supportive of crops that would require slave labor. So in 1802, they decided by popular sovereignty to vote slavery out of its state constitution. Now that makes sense if you're out there in the audience. So Lincoln will come to Cincinnati 8 days later, and he's going to vanquish this in a way that he never had done before or never will have to again. This is his southernmost speech, and he's right on the Ohio River. All right, so if you follow my hand puppet here. Here's Cincinnati. Okay, here's the Ohio River serpentining around. I just want to use serpentine in a sentence. I got it in there. Okay. And it comes up and around and dips down. What state is on the other side of the river? Kentucky. All right? Kentucky has slaves. And Lincoln just takes apart Douglas's argument because the way that river courses around, while they're in Cincinnati, there's a small part of Kentucky that's north of them. And if you follow the river course down, this little bulge here, there are Ohio River towns that are well south of this bulging part of Kentucky. And so Lincoln comes out rather haughtily and says, "Pray, what made you free? Could it be climate and soil?" And he just completely abolishes that idea by saying no, because if that was the reason, we are in a region where north of us are parts of Kentucky. Why are they completely covered with slavery and Ohio is entirely free of it? The only reason is because Ohio was part of a territory that disallowed slavery, the Ordinance of 1787, and Kentucky was not bound by that same ordinance. And then Lincoln simply transposed that argument saying that's why you have to have the same kind of laws across the Mississippi River, because the chances of having a slave-free state in those territories, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, would be much less if they were slave-free territories. The argument worked brilliantly. He only used it in Cincinnati, and because he gave a different speech, that's the speech that traveled the most. Clearly his most underrated speech. So those are the kind of messages that Lincoln established for the middle ground position. And so the messenger and the message are extremely important. And now the most important part, at least for the end of what I was going to say, is the team that took him there. Why does Lincoln become the second to the top rung of the ladder before the convention begins in 2 days? Because they argued on the battleground state basis, they being his team of supporters and the delegation that went up to Chicago. They got together, being Illinois is one of the four, right? One of the four battleground states. And the first thing they did was got Indiana on their side, the second one. So by Monday morning, they have 2 of the 4 states in their corner. They're not guaranteeing that Lincoln is going to win those 2 states in November. But what they're telling the rest of those delegates is that we are the experts of these 2 states, the experts of our party. And we're saying this guy has a better chance of winning these 2 states than any other of these 11 or 12 candidates that are going to be presented at the convention in the next in 2 days from now. So that's why all of a sudden the papers are starting to talk up Lincoln as a second, because they've already grabbed those 2 states. But here's the problem. You got to get these other 2, Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And they're not budging, okay, especially Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's caucusing like little straw polls before the convention's set to begin. And they like Lincoln. They like him a lot. Other states like him too, and he's going to get partial votes from a lot of different states. But the plan for the Lincoln folks is to try to get 100 votes in the first round. And then what did I say you need to win? Oh, you people are good. Okay, so you need 233 to win. The idea is to get 100 in the first round. And the reason for that is so that you clearly set yourself away from the rest of the field. You know you're going to be behind William Henry Seward, who could win this in the first round, but they don't think he will because there's 6 favorite sons like Lincoln that are going to get their state's complimentary vote in the first round. So the object is make sure Seward doesn't get to 233 and try to get Lincoln at 100. Well, that's ambitious. 12 candidates, you want to get 100 out of 465, that's quite a goal to get a quarter of those votes. But the most important thing is, in the next round, you want to build momentum. And you don't want this thing to go, in 1852, it went 49 ballots. You don't want that to happen because then you'll have a real dark horse coming out of nowhere to claim the nomination. So they wanted this thing not to go too many ballots. It's scripted, much like a football coach would script the first 15 plays. You actually knew how many votes your guy was going to get in each round. No big surprises are going to occur unless somebody doesn't keep their promise. So the problem with the Lincoln team was they thought they had the first round 100. They were worried about the second round. They weren't building momentum anywhere. Pennsylvania had caucus. They liked Lincoln. And in the third round, in their mock-up of each round of balloting, the Pennsylvanians notified the Illinois team that Lincoln was the winner, but by only 6 votes, and not until the third round. Not good enough and not as many as they needed. So they made the deal, all right? The Lincoln team made the deal with the Pennsylvania team that if Pennsylvania switched completely to Lincoln in the second round, and they have the second largest delegation at the convention. They have 54. That if Lincoln won the election, that Simon Cameron was going to get a position on Lincoln's cabinet. And this is controversial. Many people claim that it was done for the good of the party, but you just got to follow the line of balloting, and you just didn't abandon the third. Cameron was a third-place candidate after the first round, and they're going to go completely to Lincoln. There was a deal made, and that's how this is going to work. So the balloting was supposed to occur on Thursday, but they had to carve out a 17-plank platform, and on Friday the convention begins. And after the first round, Lincoln's getting partial votes from a lot of states. Seward, of course, is going to be the front runner. At the end of the first round, Seward has 173, Lincoln has 102, Simon Cameron is third at 51, Chase is at 50, Bates is at 49, and then the other 8 or 7 candidates after that, much less than that. What do you need to win? 233. Second round, they're voting not alphabetically by states, but geographically from the Atlantic across to the Mississippi. All of a sudden, everybody sees what's happening when they get to Pennsylvania, and they drop Cameron, and 48 more votes go to Lincoln, and everybody thought, whoa, something's happening here. But Seward's picking up votes too. Everybody else is not. And at the end of the second round, Seward is still winning. 184, Lincoln 181. All right? Third round, and now the advantage of having the home state. All right? There's a huge Lincoln crowd. They probably printed fake tickets, but that just made a lot of noise. It didn't make any effect on the outcome. What made an effect on the outcome is the platform seating. Because as the host delegation, you sat your delegations on the platform, and the 10,000 people are watching this whole process. So Judd, the guy that got Chicago as the site, was in charge of the delegation seating, and it stayed the same for all 3 days, and nobody caught on. He put the Seward people over here. That's New York. He put Lincoln over here. He surrounded New York with all the other Seward supporting states. They are locked in. And then all the undecided states are over here, next to the Lincoln crowd. So what can't the Seward people do between rounds? They can't get up and log roll. In other words, try to coax votes from coming across. And so and nobody caught on to this. So the seating is arranged this way. Seward folks are now going to be caught up in a sea of Lincoln. And after 2 rounds, it's 184 to 181. Then you get to the third round, and I don't know how you get a half a vote, but at the end of the third round, Lincoln's gaining more. What do you need to win? 233. At the end of the third round, Seward has 180. Lincoln has 231 and a half. Not quite there. They're about to start the ballot for the fourth, but 4 Ohioans announced that they're going to change this and end it. And on Friday at 2 p.m. on May 18th, Lincoln will go over the top, and he will win that nomination. Now, I'm going to end today, and hopefully have some questions and be able to give you some answers on this, by giving you an irony and a lesson of this whole nomination, the most momentous and perhaps exciting nomination in our history. History will tell us that within 11 months of that May convention, Fort Sumter is fired upon and the Civil War begins. Right? But if you read the Republican Party platform of 1860, you can Google it up, it's there, 17 planks, it is so conciliatory to the South in an effort to be to not be bellicose at all. There are planks in there that use the term rights of the states rights. There's a Republican plank that says guaranteeing protection of Southern institutions, which is a euphemism for slavery. Another plank for the protection of the fugitive slave law. Another plank for not interfering with trade, the cotton trade from the South to Europe. It couldn't be more conciliatory to the South. And if you read those planks, it's almost as Abraham Lincoln could have written it himself. And I think, even though there's no paper trail to show it, it's one of the reasons why I got picked. It's because he fit the platform so perfectly. In other words, the people that chose Abraham Lincoln at the Chicago Convention of 1860 didn't choose him because they expected him to be the guy that was going to preside over secession and Civil War. They chose Abraham Lincoln because they thought he would be the one to prevent it. Had the delegates collected in Chicago really thought that secession was inevitable, and it was by the time of the election in November, but it was not in May of 1860, are they going to choose the Illinois lawyer without any prominent position, the 2-time Senate loser? No way. They'll choose the statesman. They would have chosen Seward. They didn't think it was inevitable, and they chose Lincoln because they thought he was the most appeasing candidate for the South because of that middle ground message. So what is Lincoln famous for today? He is the savior of the Union and the emancipator of the slaves, which are two great facets that had no role at all in the minds of the conventioneers that chose him. So that's the irony. And the lesson from all this is, despite the best intentions and the best studied efforts, sometimes our best leaders are those that accomplish what was not expected of them rather than or in addition to what was expected of them. Thank you. We have some time for some questions.
In terms of state delegations represented at the wigwam, was there no representation from any southern or border states?
The wigwam was the convention hall that he brings up where this convention occurred. There's a nice marker to it. Everybody thought it burned in the Chicago fire of 1871. It actually burned, but a few years earlier. And what of those 465 delegations there, this is a whole different story, and I'll make it really short. There were a couple, well, Missouri's there, of course, and Maryland is there, and we'll call Delaware that as well because it has slavery. Kentucky is there. Seward actually had a delegation brought up from Texas, 5 or 6, because they were Seward people. And he had a delegation brought up from Virginia. Now, this would include some of the counties that are now West Virginia, but it included Shenandoah Valley, Loudoun County. You're getting closer and closer to here as well. You had District of Columbia there as well. There was an attempt to try to prevent Seward from getting these delegations to actually cast a vote, because they were in states that had no chance of a Republican winning anyway. But the effort to bar those votes on the Thursday before the voting began was killed by Seward's people. A great move. Probably the most unheralded thing that Lincoln's team did that night is they met in conference with the Virginia folks, and they stole 14 of the 22 Virginians. And the only reason Lincoln cleared 100 votes in the first round were those 14 Virginians, who they didn't expect to get if the balloting was really going to begin that Thursday instead of Friday like it was supposed to. So that's the irony of all of it, is that those folks came up to go for Seward, and Lincoln's team was able to get a good proportion of them. Question?
Well, following up on that, what were some of the other strategies that Lincoln's team used to gather those other votes away from Seward?
Well, I already mentioned about the idea of the battleground states. One of the things they did was they do what politicians do today. They try to cast their opponent in the worst possible light, even if they take his message out of context deliberately, which they did. And they try to cast their guy as the perfect representative of the party principles. And in doing so, they also used, there is an effort, I'll give you one quick example of another way, that Lincoln's team had a real tough time getting across this Seward superiority deal, because the Seward supporting areas like New Jersey wanted a Seward-Lincoln ticket. They wanted it really badly because they thought it was a surefire winner to bring the Westerner and the Easterner together. And you know how Lincoln's team was able to get rid of that ticket? They said, well, Seward is an old Whig, and Lincoln's an old Whig. You can't put two Whigs on the same ticket. You'll lose 60,000 votes in Illinois. The anti-Nebraska Act Democrats won't vote for that ticket. So you either have to make your decision between the two or decide that this ticket has no chance of winning. So they basically did the gamble and say you can't put him on this ticket because there's no Democratic representative on that ticket.
You're saying it's basically from arguing that Lincoln was more winnable,
Yeah.
rather than making more deals like they've done.
They made, like I said, the deal they made that I won't call it a smoking gun, but boy, there's enough components of it, is Pennsylvania. The rest of that was the battleground state argument. Okay, they got Indiana and Illinois together. Remember, those two states together only 48 votes out of 233. New York, 70. All right, that's by delegate votes. That doesn't mean a lot. It's the idea of winning what you won in 1856 plus these states, and that was really the strongest argument they can make using Lincoln's middle ground message.
Did you find any information regarding the relationship of Hamlin and Lincoln?
The question was, did I find any thing prior to the nomination on a relationship between Lincoln and Hamlin?
When they were together.
They didn't get together until, you'll have to read Harold Holzer's book, Lincoln President-elect. They'll get together after the election. That's the first time they ever meet in Chicago. They never met before. Never met. And I say get that because he's plugging somebody else's book. Can you believe that? But he talks all about this meeting. So in other words, everything you did then was by face or by name recognition. So Lincoln and Hamlin had never met.
What was the name of the other? There's a distant member of the family, it's the great-granddaughter of,
Oh, and she claims that they knew each other before?
no. I just know that.
'Cause maybe they did, I
She
would-
is the great-great.
Of Hamlin.
And what book did you?
Oh, Lincoln President-elect by Harold Holzer.
Thank you.
Yep.
Continuing on to the general election,
Yeah.
Lincoln ended up winning, but with less than 40% of the vote.
Yeah, we'll make this the last question. But this is, go ahead.
If he had lost that election, would we have still had the Civil War?
If he had lost the election to who? Because, well, let me answer it this way. If you want the Civil War to begin the day after the election, okay, rather than 4 months later, think about this, all right? Lincoln, here's a new number for you. 303 electoral votes are there for the taking, so you need half of that, like, do the math there, you're at 152, I suppose, to win. Lincoln only had 39% of the popular vote between 4 candidates, but he had 182 electoral college votes. In other words, if you added up the electoral college votes of everybody else, and you put their popular vote, and you said, just statistically, I'm going to put it all on one guy, let's say Breckinridge in the South, all right, Lincoln still would have had 39% of the vote, okay, by this easy math thing. I know it would change if you only had 2 people, you'd vote differently, but just follow along my argument. He would have won the election with 172 electoral votes, but only taken 39% of the popular vote. Somebody that took 61% of the popular vote isn't going to be seated as president. If it's a Southern candidate, Civil War is going to begin the next day, okay? That's the way I would look at it. So if a Southerner had won, Civil War wouldn't have begun. Any Republican, except for perhaps Edward Bates, I think the Civil War would have begun. Half and half if Douglas had won, since he was a Northern Democrat. There was enough Southern antipathy to Douglas that there might have been some secession after that. I suppose that should be it for that. Thank you so much for coming out, listening to me.
Folks, as I said, we're going to be moving down to the shop for the book signing. The book is available, 15% discount on signing day.